Hello, I'm Chanel, and I am an untaxable wealth and retirement strategist. And welcome to another episode of Crap Now What? I host this episode to share with people some things that are along the spectrum of wealth and wealth strategies. They could be anything from a brand new idea where we're talking about debt and handling your money, all the way up to some more specifics about taxes and how taxes can affect our wealth and help us to have more of our own hard-earned dollars to enjoy in life as well as in retirement. If this is the first time that you've stumbled upon, I would imagine that you're going to learn something because some of my thoughts are a little bit more unusual than what you might hear. They're a little less traditional. And that is because I tie together the concept of that if you're going to have your own money and enjoy it as much as possible, it's best to be informed rather than being uninformed. And I would imagine that you would agree that you would prefer to be informed. So today, what we're going to talk about is a different form of debt. I've got a few notes here, but I'm actually going to show you a chart. We're going to talk about debt and the enormous amount of debt that our government owes others. I think this is a concept that many of you are familiar with, something that is not brand new news. The thing that is probably the most striking is how large that debt is and how it continues to grow and grow and grow. And we all know if we were people and this was our budget, that eventually, as they would say, the chickens come home to roost. You eventually have to address that debt. It's not something that just goes away. I've touched on this before. You can't just not open up your bills and pretend that you don't have to pay them, that if you don't open them up, that they're not due. And so we're going to share some of my thought. I'm going to share with you, excuse me. I'm going to share with you some of my thoughts about the debt and how large and how impactful this is going to be on people and their future. So stick with me for a moment. We'll see if my technology cooperates as I go to pull up the national debt clock. So I have it up here on my screen. I'm going to switch over to be able to share it with you. I have it a little bit on the large side, so we might have to scroll across. And I'm sharing it with you from my screen so that you don't have to leave this show to go and look at the usdebt.org clock, first of all. And I'm going to draw on this a little bit so you can see what my eyes are seeing. Anybody who's looking over my shoulder and who's watching this can see on my screen numbers that are just rolling over, continually counting. This has to be, if this is the first time you've ever really seen the US debt clock, or even if this isn't your first time, it still has to be a little bit overwhelming at how fast the debt is rising. So let's talk about that. Right here is the 34 million, nearly 35, excuse me, trillion, I know better, the 34, nearly $35 trillion of debt that our government owes. If you're looking here at how fast it's going up, even in the few minutes that we're going to be together today, you can see that it's going up by the millions. This has to be incredibly daunting for most people. What I find fascinating is, let's take that math a little bit further. How much that debt is per citizen, how much that debt is per taxpayer. We're talking about $103,000 per citizen. So from the tiniest little infant to those that have been blessed to live over 100 years old, Our country owes $103,000 per head. And I don't mean to be crude when I say it that way, but per person, per person. How many people actually, even in our own country, make that amount of money themselves, let alone be able to be partially responsible for that tax burden and that debt? And I say tax burden because our debt from our country, the way our country earns money is through taxes. So in order to pay this debt, our country has to do and make moves in order to remove it, which many of us have heard over the years that just keeps getting pushed down the road. Doesn't have to be dealt with now. We can take care of it later. Well, we know how that would look if it was in our own checkbook, our own banking accounts. Debt per taxpayer. I'm going to show some other big numbers here. Our actual tax revenue is about 4 trillion, almost 5 trillion. So this is where we can start to see where we're going to have some problems one day. We already have some because inflation is caused by this enormous debt. So revenue per citizen is about $14,000, which most people can actually track with that number when we go to pay our own taxes, or if we're ever looking at our pay stubs and we can see how much we've actually been paying in. We can see when we get our taxes prepared, as I said, which wasn't that long ago. Many of us wrap that up, that we're probably, that's an identifiable number. But of course, don't have to be Einstein to see with nearly 35 trillion in debt, collecting at this level is nowhere near going to get us where we need to be. That's federal tax, income tax revenue. More about taxes. When we go to look at this, there's also payroll taxes. And I'm not going to dive into this too much, but when we think about our country's taxes, the taxes are layered and layered and layered, not just the independent taxes that we pay as individuals, but there's also, as you can see, payroll tax revenue, other excise taxes, and so on and so forth. Even excise taxes in the billions, it's not in the trillions. Independently of this show, I encourage you to take a look at the US debt clock on your own, because there are still so many facets as you go all the way down this page, including down here where it's showing how our budget is spent. The single most expensive item is the Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. Anybody who knows and has heard about the baby boomers, we're just really on some of that early part of our aging Americans that are going to be looking for these benefits. Here's national defense, and then here's the interest that we're paying on this debt. So I'm going to put it back to you. If honestly, this was your personal debt on any level, you can take it down to the tens of thousands. And if the income that you're bringing in is just a fraction of what your debt is, if the interest rate is going up rapidly, get into credit cards. Oftentimes those credit cards are 18 to 20% interest. You get yourself into a credit card and you owe 8 to 10,000, you might be paying another 200 to 250 or more. We can all get our calculators out, but it's sometimes amazing if you decide to even pass for 1 month paying on the interest or paying on the balance, the amount of interest that suddenly accumulates. This is how a person gets a snowball effect on how much money that they owe other people. If you personally handled your checkbook like this, then you would eventually have to do one of two things: cut back on your spending or make more money, or a combination of both in order to get yourself righted. If we extrapolate that same type of budget responsibility onto our own government, who is completely spending far more money than they're bringing in, and this has been going on for years. It keeps, like I said, gets pushed on down the road. I'm not going to get into the politics of it because one administration over the other doesn't necessarily get it all completely straightened out, no matter how many times there are furloughs with the government, no matter how many times there are bills and a budget bill and everything going to the Senate and the House. The point is that eventually, the government is either going to need to reduce spending or collect more money. And where are they going to collect money from? Think about it. Taxes, more pressure on business owners with payroll tax revenue, other excise taxes. Here's your corporate tax revenue, tariffs. We know what happens when we start getting involved in imports and exports and things along those lines. Over here, I've got it cut off just a little bit, but this is estate and gift taxes. This is inheritances. This is not a foreign idea that our government would start to continue to look in different buckets. We can already see where are different piles of money possibly sitting, where can we gather more dollars. They've already made changes in how inheritances are. There used to be a time if somebody inherited a 401k, an IRA, or an annuity, it kind of gets sliced a little bit differently, but I'm just going to give you the general idea that it used to be that if a person inherited from their parents or from someone else that gifted them this inheritance that they were the beneficiary of, that it, in some cases, those funds could keep rolling over. Not in every example. And somebody who wants to correct me and say, well, that's not exactly the true, it definitely is with annuities and things back in the day. But inherited IRAs, another example, those can no longer just be passed on from one generation to another. And it used to be a little bit like that. Then the government said, oh, goodness gracious, well, this is a tax deferred account. This account was money that was put away like a 401k is tax deferred. We've given tax breaks slightly in order for these people to collect money within a 401k or an IRA. And then now, if it goes on inherited, we're never going to get our taxes. So now most inherited funds have a 10-year window now, that the person who inherited the funds and the dollars has to take a minimum each year, and by the end of the 10th year, all of that account has to be gone, or at least they're paying taxes on it. So there's some different strategies within there. So these are not hard and fast rules, so to speak, but the point is, eventually the government looks at buckets of money and where can we possibly collect more taxes. They're not going to necessarily just stop at cutting. They have to look at the other side, because we have the largest debt in the world. There's another clock here, and I'm not going to click over to it right away, but there are world debt clocks to see what other countries have in debt and comparable. We're more than 7 times larger than the next country. Okay, so I've got some other interesting news for you along the lines of taxes. I believe that most people who are listening to this feel like they're already paying enough taxes. And we don't want to be taxed anymore. We've already had the last few years where the cost of living, the inflation has gone up, how our budgets, our personal home budgets for most people have had less money available for groceries, less money for entertaining, less money for gas. That's kind of, some of it's softened up a little bit, but you're getting the picture. It hasn't been really the easiest last few years. I've watched it, especially with a lot of young families having challenges where it used to be a little bit more comfortable. Now it's not as comfortable, and it's not looking like it's going to shape better in any direction for a little while. Along those lines, income tax rates have changed over and over and over again over the years. We're somewhat familiar with it that once in a while we get an administration that gets the budget balanced a little closer, or they get something done within the political world once in a while, but we don't get this all that often. Once in a while we get that, and we have maybe lower taxes, but there's been history of extremely high taxes in our country. Go back to after the Depression, after the war, in order to pay and balance the budget, people were being taxed at 90%. 90%. Can you imagine if 90% of your earnings was going right off the top to the government? Well, even though it feels like we've been taxed heavily, at the end of next year, 2025, we are right now in one of the near historic lows of percentages of how much we're paying in our income to taxes. That's ordinary Americans that have maybe not the information that the uber rich and the other wealthy individuals in our country who are informed of ways to minimize their taxes. We talk about average households who are doing their own taxes through an online program, who may not understand or know, not necessarily understand, just not be familiar with ways to cut their taxes overall, strategies, and have anything in their toolbox. Households right now are paying some of the lowest percentage in history, going back almost 100 years. One of the lowest percentages in income tax. I can pull up another chart that shows kind of the heartbeat line of that. We'll bring that for another topic, another day. Let's just focus on the fact at the end of 2025, unless there is a change and our political machines decide and figure out a way to re-up the current tax cuts that we are actually a part of right now. They go back to 2017. They are technically the Trump tax cuts. Again, trying not to get into the politics side of it, but the idea that I want you to understand is that we have a huge rising debt. We are about to, at the end of 2025, have the end of the lowest period in recent history of tax cuts. And what do we think is going to happen? If it's not re-upped, here's a couple of examples of what's going to happen if we end up going back to the 2017 levels. it will change, and this is all CPA tax talk, but it will change how taxes are calculated for every household. There was a shift from standard deductions to from personal exemptions to standard deductions. So the standard deduction will go in half. The personal exemption returns. So how people are filing and different things that can or cannot be deducted are going to change. I'll just put that in as clean a speak definition. The special 20% tax deduction of pass-through to businesses. So small business owners, that 20% tax deduction that was a part of this last period in order to spark and support small business owners, that is expected to go away. If everything goes and nothing gets redone, these things will be gone after 2025. So by 2026, this impact will be felt. There will, the cap that is on state and local taxes ends. So anybody who has, well, we all know, we don't just pay federal taxes, we pay state taxes, local taxes. How many people have looked at one of their last receipts when they went through the restaurants? And other local taxes that the cities can impose. There will be changes to the estate tax, and exemptions will be reduced. Remember how I said how our tax system looks at different buckets and different ways to collect money without the humor of the fact that it's falling short. These different buckets, and if you look at the different areas that are going to be changing or potentially changing if our government doesn't step in and renew these tax breaks, the different layers. I can almost hear some of the small business owners that I know holding their breath, especially if they have young families. It really hits everyone. But if somebody, and I would harbor to guess, probably a very intelligent guess, that many of the people who are watching this have already thought of 2 or 3 ways that they're going to be affected and may not have even known. A lot of people are not aware that this is about to happen. So we have 2 big lanes that are running right now. We have this enormous debt that's going up by the millions just as we breathe during this talk. And we have tax cuts from various different buckets that could very much be going away in the very foreseeable near future. I'm going to add one more thing to this. Not that I'm trying to lose my audience. I'm telling you 100%, Crap Now What is about the difference between being informed and uninformed. So that is the spirit of today's conversation, is to help people be as informed as possible. It wasn't but a couple years ago, coming off of COVID, and we're not really off of it, but you know, the big surge of the pandemic, when so many people started to work from home, and it changed how taxes and things were being figured in a way, because all of a sudden we have people with home offices. Is it really a home office, or is it a satellite office of the main company that they work for? The extra expenses that some people had to put into it, the small businesses that were struggling to stay open, their doors open, that suddenly our government realized that they were potentially missing out on tax revenue because of this big upheaval, so to speak. But the IRS realized that they didn't think maybe everything was adding up with the taxes that were being collected during this period, plus everything that was going on potentially with the amount of tax revenue that was coming in because of the pandemic, that they hired another 80,000 auditors. Those 80,000 auditors are still milling around. It's only been, I believe, 2 tax seasons. That is another place that is a potential pain point, in particular for anyone who's an individual that's kind of running the line with what they're taking for deductions and not, especially if you're filling out your own taxes. Sometimes we might get a little more aggressive in what we try to put through as a deduction. It especially is another potential stressor for small businesses that are already feeling the impact or maybe coming out of this period where things were so difficult that we really don't want auditors out there. Maybe some of us don't. And I'm saying we globally, not necessarily individually, but when we come down to the fact that our government's going to need to collect more money, the IRS already made a move a few years ago to add 80,000 more auditors. There are things that are continually happening around us to have our government at least try to find those buckets of money. There is no tax idea or tax cut idea that ever goes away. If it does not get picked during a certain year or a certain administration, I know people who have been close to legislation and they talk about the binders of ideas that get put up on shelves. And then the next time we have to try to figure out how to balance the budget, which of course, try to figure out is probably the more accurate way of saying it. The books come off the shelf, we start opening it up and say, okay, well, we didn't do that before, but look at all the potential revenue if we do that. This is not all doom and gloom. I do have some concerns about the younger generations and where they're going to be financially unless they focus at this stage in their life on staying as personally minimally in debt yourself, so that as you ride the wave of all these potential extra expenses in life, raising children, we don't even have to get into the fact that day-to-day budget and housing and everything else is very expensive. But I do have some concerns with so many people living longer, the larger impact, as I mentioned, on Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. These are things that the government doesn't want to take away because voters are important. That this continual snowball, this continual effect of burden is going to at least continue to impact inflation and potentially impact people who want to be independent, have their own businesses, etc. So what I want you to do, be informed. There is an app that you can download. Who needs another app on their phone? Not too many. This one's kind of depressing, but there is an app to continue to have and watch this US debt clock. You can Google for it too. It's easy to find online. It's interesting. If nothing else, a person should be informed. If you're in any of the generations that are coming up that are going to be potentially paying these massive bills, like I said, make sure you keep your own house in order financially. Get good habits in so that you're in the best position that you can be to feel comfortable in life financially. For those people that have 401ks, any other tax deferred accounts, for young people who are about to consider starting a tax deferred account, a 401k, or an IRA, I'm just going to be blunt. What people were told in my generation is that you'll be making less later. You won't be paying as many taxes. Do the 401k. Many people in my generation have $500, $1 million, a lot of money socked away, and they're all tax deferred accounts, or a large percentage of them are tax deferred accounts, because we were told this was a good thing. That hasn't really changed in all these years. For those who haven't started down that path, there are strategies to help keep you in a place where your money and your future can be untaxed. This is what I said. I'm an untaxed retirement or untaxable wealth strategist. If you happen to be someone who has qualified accounts, 401ks, IRAs, tax deferred accounts, you're best to ring up somebody like myself to help figure out how to start taxing those before, as I said, and I hate to be kind of kitschy, but before the chickens come to roost. And all of a sudden, I've seen calculators that show more than 50% of that getting taxed because of all the different layers of taxes, including the part that gets onto the beneficiaries, the heirs, and how much they pay in taxes. And it makes people sad. We'll come to another topic. We'll use some actual numbers so you can actually see how discouraging it can be after working so hard to save so much money, to see how little a person will personally be able to enjoy it, but then how little will actually eventually go on to the beneficiaries, that family legacy. So be informed, look, reach out, ask me more questions about how dollars can be untaxed. Share with others. I keep imploring every time we have one of these shows to share with others. Even if you're not feeling as knowledgeable to be able to speak on it on yourself, help connect people with someone like me. Not just because I want to earn their business. I don't just sit here on a podcast just to earn people's business. I love to help people. It's one of my passions. I am in the space of helping people be as informed as possible. Shuffle your dollars, move your dollars. If you, again, you're not familiar with how to do that, there are different ways to find out. Make sure though that when you are reaching out, there's a very, very small fraction of people such as myself that what we do is that we look at this through a lens that most accountants don't, most financial advisors don't, and most other specialists. And this is a very narrow margin of people who look at this from the viewpoint, this bird's eye viewpoint, like I do. And this is why I keep getting on camera to share some of these ideas with you. So be careful with who you talk to, just to be fair, because I've seen people accidentally get down a different path they didn't plan on. And in some ways, be brave. Use this opportunity to be informed, to feel more confident, to feel more brave about the choices that you're making with your money and your future and your family's future. So I'm going to wrap this up. Keep tuning in, please. If you find these ideas are concepts that are meaningful to you and there's something that you feel like you're learning, please share it with someone else. Tune in for the podcast. Find me on my other socials under Blazing Star Strategies, Wealth Strategies. You'll find too that I have other formats such as workshops that can be found on goblazingstar.com and other segments in my socials. If you happen to be in the Wichita area later this month, June 24th and 25th, the specific topic that I'm going to blow out is the idea of Social Security and retirement. with a little bit of information about how to untax some of those dollars and keep within the parameters so that you get to enjoy most of those dollars as best as possible. I'll keep bringing some of those segments to this podcast as well. In July, still a to be determined location, been looking at some really great venues in the Bentonville, Arkansas area. That topic is going to be women and wealth. And so that has a little different twist to it, a little bit more of an umbrella, and help to educate, in particular, women on different ways that they can use wealth strategies. And that is intended to be July 15th and 16th, with more locations to come. I'll be hosting probably a workshop every month, and there will be some on-demand versions that you'll be invited to as well. So thank you to my team. I love my team. I've got Michaela and Hans with me as producers from Ren's Marketing. They're a great partnership that I've developed, and it's going to be a long running one, and great talented ladies. Caleb from Sound Media edits, posts. They make me look good, keep encouraging me to share these ideas. And with that, I'll see you next week.